talking and show me your papers.
I am a federal judge. You have no probable cause.
A judge out here buying fruit?
Yes, and you're violating federal law.
You don't look like someone who belongs anywhere near a bench.
Everything you're doing is being recorded.
Let's go.
The farmer's market on Briarcliff Lane was the kind of place where nothing ever went wrong. White tents lined the sidewalk, bushels of stone fruit catching the early Virginia sun, the smell of fresh bread drifting between vendors who knew their customers by name. It was 9:15 on a Saturday morning, and federal judge Nadine Achebe Coleman was doing what she did almost every weekend, buying peaches. She was 54 years old, appointed to the federal bench by the President of the United States, confirmed by the Senate with bipartisan support, and had spent the last 11 years presiding over some of the most complex civil rights and constitutional cases in the Fourth Circuit. She had written opinions cited by the Supreme Court. She had been shortlisted twice for elevation to the appellate bench. Legal scholars described her as one of the sharpest judicial minds of her generation. But that Saturday morning, none of that mattered. She wasn't wearing her robe. She wasn't sitting behind the bench in her courtroom. She was wearing a linen blouse, sunglasses pushed up on her head, a canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder, standing in front of a fruit stand and squeezing peaches to check for ripeness, the way her mother had taught her decades ago. She was relaxed. She was unguarded. She was smiling at the vendor, making small talk about the weather and whether the white peaches were better this year than last. She had no idea that 40 feet away, parked in an unmarked black SUV with tinted windows on the opposite side of the street, 2 ICE agents were watching her, and they had already decided, before she had spoken a single word, before she had done a single thing wrong, that she did not belong there. The man behind the wheel of the SUV was Bryce Kessler, 42 years old, 16 years with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and a reputation that depended entirely on who you asked. His supervisors called him aggressive but effective. His colleagues called him old school, the same dangerous euphemism that always meant the same thing. The communities he patrolled had a different word for him entirely. Kessler had built his career on what the agency internally referred to as street pickups, approaching individuals in public spaces, demanding documentation, and detaining anyone who hesitated or couldn't immediately prove their immigration status. On paper, it looked like proactive enforcement. In practice, it was racial profiling so consistent it could have been a written policy. 7 formal complaints had been filed against Kessler over the past 5 years. Every single one from Black or Latino individuals who had been stopped in affluent neighborhoods, questioned without cause, and in several cases, detained for hours before being released without charges. Every single complaint had been reviewed by Internal Affairs. Every single one had been dismissed. Kessler had learned the same lesson that every officer like him eventually learned, that as long as nobody important was watching, the system would protect him. His partner that morning was Dominic Peretti, 36, 5 years on the job, and the kind of agent who had long ago stopped thinking for himself. Peretti had never once questioned one of Kessler's stops, never filed a dissenting report, never raised a concern about the pattern that was obvious to anyone paying attention. They were supposedly running a routine sweep that morning, looking for an undocumented male suspect connected to a workplace visa violation 3 counties away. The suspect was described as male, mid-20s, 5'7". Nadine Achebe Coleman was female, 54 years old, 5'9", and alone at a farmer's market buying fruit. She matched nothing on any warrant, nothing in any database, nothing on any bulletin. But Kessler watched her anyway, because in his mind, a black woman in an upscale Virginia neighborhood was reason enough. Kessler opened the driver's side door and stepped out onto the pavement with the kind of deliberate, unhurried confidence that came from years of knowing nobody had ever held him accountable for anything. Peretti followed a half-step behind, falling into formation the way he always did, the way he had been doing since his first week partnered with Kessler. They crossed the street without urgency, weaving between the white tents and morning shoppers, their eyes locked on Nadine the entire time. She didn't notice them until they were less than 10 feet away. Kessler spoke first, his voice carrying the flat, commanding tone of a man who expected immediate compliance and had no patience for anything less. He told her he needed to see identification. Nadine looked up from the peaches she was holding, her expression shifting from surprise to something more measured, more careful. She asked why. It was a simple question, a reasonable question, a question any citizen had the right to ask when approached by law enforcement without warning or explanation. Kessler told her they were conducting an immigration enforcement action in the area and that she needed to verify her status. The words landed in the warm morning air like something heavy and wrong. Nadine set the peaches down slowly, her hands steady, her voice calm and clear as she stated that she was a United States citizen and asked what probable cause they had for approaching her. While she spoke, Peretti moved silently to her left, positioning himself between Nadine and the open walkway behind her, cutting off the path she would have taken to leave. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. She wasn't being questioned. She was being boxed in. Goldie Hartwell, the 71-year-old woman who ran the peach stand and had known Nadine as a Saturday morning regular for over 3 years, stood frozen behind her table, her weathered hands still resting on a crate of fruit, her eyes wide with confusion and the beginnings of fear. Other shoppers had started to notice. A couple pushing a stroller slowed. A man carrying a bag of tomatoes stopped mid-step. The atmosphere at the market was shifting, the easy Saturday warmth giving way to something tense and electric. Kessler's expression changed the moment Nadine asked about probable cause. His jaw tightened, his posture squared. He was not accustomed to being questioned, and he was especially not accustomed to being questioned by a black woman who spoke with the kind of authority that made his own sound small. Nadine told them clearly and without hesitation that she was under no legal obligation to produce immigration documents, that she was a natural-born United States citizen, and that she was a sitting federal judge. She said the words calmly but firmly, enunciating every syllable with the precision of someone who had spent over a decade choosing her words from the bench and understood exactly how much weight they carried. For a moment, the air between them seemed to hold still. Then Kessler laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncertain laugh, an open, dismissive laugh that carried across the market stalls and made at least 3 nearby shoppers turn their heads. He looked at Peretti and said loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear, "They all say something like that." The contempt in his voice was total. The assumption behind it was clear. In Kessler's world, a black woman claiming to be a federal judge wasn't stating a verifiable fact. She was running a con. He accused her of being evasive, of refusing to cooperate with a lawful immigration action, and ordered her to place her hands flat on the wooden table of the produce stand. Nadine did not move. She repeated, with the same steady control that had commanded courtrooms and silenced hostile attorneys, that she was a sitting United States federal judge, that her judicial credentials were in her vehicle 30 feet away, and that they were making a very serious mistake. She warned them that every second they continued was compounding the legal consequences they would face. Kessler didn't hesitate. His hand shot forward, gripping Nadine's left arm just above the elbow, and in one brutal motion, he twisted it behind her back with enough force to send a jolt of pain through her shoulder. Her body pitched forward into the table, sending peaches rolling off the edge and scattering across the pavement in every direction. Goldie Hartwell screamed, her hands flying to her mouth, her voice cutting through the morning like a siren. Shoppers froze. A mother pulled her child behind her, and 15 feet away, retired Marine Colonel Warren Osei, 67, a decorated veteran who had served 3 combat tours and recognized injustice the way only someone who had fought for this country could, raised his phone and began recording. His hands were steady. His angle was clear. Kessler's body camera was already rolling, the red light blinking on his chest, capturing every frame of what he was doing from his own perspective. So was Peretti's. 3 recordings, 3 angles, every second of what came next preserved in a clarity that no lie, no report, no internal investigation would ever be able to erase. Kessler drove Nadine forward and down onto the folding table with both hands. The legs buckled instantly. Nadine hit the asphalt hard, her sunglasses flying off and shattering on the pavement. Peaches crushed beneath the collapsed table inches from her face. Her left wrist, already twisted, wrenched at an angle that sent pain radiating from her fingers to her shoulder. Before she could take a full breath, Peretti was on her, pulling her arms together and cinching a plastic zip tie around both wrists with mechanical efficiency. Kessler stepped back and keyed his radio, his voice flat and professional, completely detached from the violence he had just committed. He reported a non-compliant subject resisting an immigration hold and requested transport to the field processing facility. Every word was a lie. Nadine had not resisted. She had answered every question. She had repeatedly offered to provide identification that would have resolved the entire encounter in seconds. But Kessler's radio call was already building the false record designed to justify everything he had done. Nadine lay on the ground, her cheek pressed to warm asphalt, her voice shaking but controlled with a discipline forged across decades on the bench. She stated her full name, her title, her court. She told them her judicial credentials were in her car 30 feet away. Kessler looked down at her and said 5 words his body camera captured with perfect clarity. "We'll sort that out at the facility." Around them, at least 7 people had their phones raised and recording. A woman near the bread vendor was crying, her 2 young children pressed against her legs. Colonel Osei moved closer, hand steady, capturing everything in frame. And Nadine Achebe Coleman, a federal judge confirmed by the United States Senate, lay face down on a sidewalk in zip ties because a man with a badge had decided her skin color was probable cause. Goldie Hartwell broke first. The 71-year-old vendor stepped out from behind her collapsed table, voice trembling with fury, shouting that she knew this woman, that her name was Nadine, that she was a judge, that she came every Saturday, and that what they were doing was criminal. Kessler didn't look at her. He told her to step back and stay out of official business. From across the market, Reverend Solomon Niathi, 63, senior pastor of Grace Covenant Church, moved through the crowd with quiet authority. He identified himself and told Kessler he was making a grave error. He urged him to verify her identity before taking her anywhere. Kessler's response was immediate. He told the Reverend to back off or face obstruction charges. Then came another voice, sharp and certain, cutting through the noise from the edge of the crowd. "That's Judge Achebe Coleman. She sits on the 4th Circuit. I attended her lecture at Georgetown last semester. That is a federal judge." Inez Carrillo, 24, a second-year law student, was pointing directly at Nadine's face, still pressed against the asphalt, her voice carrying with the force of someone who understood exactly what she was witnessing. For the first time, Kessler hesitated. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt, not remorse, but the faintest recognition that the ground beneath him might be shifting. Peretti pulled him aside, just far enough to lower their voices, but not far enough to escape the microphones on their own body cameras, which captured every word with devastating clarity. Peretti asked what they should do. Kessler's answer was quiet but absolute. "Doesn't matter. We finish what we start. She can prove it at processing." 14 words that would become the most replayed audio in the entire case. 14 words that proved this was never about enforcement or the law. It was about control, ego, and 2 men who believed their badges made them untouchable. Nadine was placed in the back of the unmarked SUV without a seatbelt. Her wrists were still zip-tied behind her back, the plastic cutting into skin that was already swelling and bruised. The door closed and the vehicle pulled away from the farmer's market, leaving behind a crowd of stunned witnesses, a destroyed produce stand, and crushed peaches drying on hot pavement. The drive to the ice field processing facility took 40 minutes. Nadine didn't speak a single word the entire time. She sat upright, staring straight ahead, her face unreadable. But behind that silence, a mind that had spent 11 years dissecting constitutional law from the federal bench was already working. She was cataloging every violation, every unlawful act, every word that had been spoken, every second of force that had no legal justification. She was building a case, and she hadn't even arrived at the facility yet. Kessler and Peretti, meanwhile, talked freely in the front seats, unaware or unconcerned that Kessler's body camera was still recording. The audio captured Kessler's voice clearly as he glanced in the rearview mirror and said, "A federal judge buying fruit, sure, sweetheart." Peretti laughed. The sound was casual, easy, the laughter of a man who had spent 5 years treating cruelty as routine. At the facility, Nadine was processed like any other detainee. She was photographed. Her personal items were confiscated. Her tote bag, her wallet, her phone, her car keys. She was escorted to a holding cell and placed inside with 3 other detained women who looked at her torn blouse and zip tie marks with recognition and exhaustion. A federal judge, appointed by the president, confirmed by the United States Senate, was sitting on a metal bench in an immigration detention cell, and the 2 men who put her there still thought they had done nothing wrong. 90 minutes passed before Nadine was allowed a phone call. 90 minutes of sitting on a metal bench under fluorescent lights in a room that smelled like industrial disinfectant and despair. When they finally handed her a phone, she dialed 1 number. Her husband, retired Army Brigadier General Tobias Coleman, answered on the second ring. She spoke for less than 2 minutes. Her voice was steady. She told him where she was, what had happened, and what she needed him to do. Tobias Coleman had commanded soldiers in combat zones and had coordinated operations that involved heads of state. Within 3 minutes of hanging up, he was on the phone with Judge Ramona Forsyth, Chief Judge of the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals and Nadine's direct superior in the federal judiciary. Forsyth listened in silence for exactly 45 seconds before saying 4 words. "I'm calling the DOJ." Within 20 minutes, a chain of phone calls was moving through the highest levels of the federal government with a speed that only happens when the system realizes it has turned on one of its own. The Department of Justice contacted ICE headquarters. ICE headquarters contacted the regional field office. The regional field office contacted the processing facility. A senior supervisor named Arthur Devane was sitting at his desk when his phone rang with a call from a number he had never seen before. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When it ended, the color had drained completely from his face. He stood, walked down the corridor to the holding cells, looked through the reinforced glass window, and saw a woman in a torn linen blouse with red marks on her wrists sitting on a metal bench among immigration detainees. A federal judge. In his facility. Processed by his agents. And the full, catastrophic weight of what had happened hit him all at once, like a freight train with no brakes. Nadine Achebe Coleman walked out of ICE custody after 2 hours and 47 minutes. Supervisor Arthur Devane personally cut the zip ties from her wrists, offered water, offered medical attention, and began apologizing with the desperate urgency of a man who understood his career was now tied to the worst decision 2 agents under his authority had ever made. Nadine accepted the water. She declined everything else. She said nothing about the pain in her wrist or the scrape on her cheek or the humiliation of being photographed and processed like a criminal in a facility she could have shut down with a single ruling from her bench. She made only 2 requests: that all body camera footage from both agents be preserved immediately and without alteration, and that she be given the full legal names and badge numbers of every agent involved in her detention. Then she walked out. Tobias Coleman was standing in the parking lot beside a black sedan. Next to him were 2 attorneys from one of Washington's most respected civil rights firms and a former federal prosecutor who had spent 18 years putting corrupt law enforcement officers in prison. They saw Nadine before she saw them. The torn blouse, the bruised wrists already darkening to purple, the raw scrape across her right cheekbone where her face had met the asphalt of a farmer's market sidewalk. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Photos were taken immediately, clinical and thorough, documenting every mark on her body. Medical examination began within the hour at a private facility where a physician cataloged her injuries with the precision of someone who understood the photographs would eventually be projected on a courtroom screen. By that evening, every major news outlet in the country was running the story. By midnight, the footage Colonel Osei had recorded at the farmer's market had been viewed over 4 million times, and it was only Saturday. Federal investigators arrived within 48 hours. Teams from the DHS Office of Inspector General and the DOJ Civil Rights Division descended on the field office with the kind of coordinated intensity that only came when the government understood it was investigating itself. Body camera footage from both Kessler and Peretti was pulled, duplicated, and reviewed frame by frame in a secure room where every pause, every rewind, every sharp intake of breath from the investigators watching told the same story. The footage was devastating. Colonel Osei's phone recording was collected and synchronized with the body cam angles, creating a three-perspective reconstruction that left no moment unaccounted for and no lie survivable. Witness statements were taken from 14 people who had been at the farmer's market that morning, and their accounts were consistent with a uniformity that only happens when every person is simply describing the same undeniable truth. But the investigation didn't stop at the farmer's market. When investigators pulled Kessler's complete service record, what they found was a pattern so clear and so damning it should have ended his career years before he ever laid hands on Nadine Achebe Coleman. Over 60 stops in affluent neighborhoods across 4 years, the overwhelming majority targeting Black and Latino individuals. In 23 of those stops, the subjects were United States citizens with no immigration issues of any kind. People detained, questioned, humiliated, and released without apology because the color of their skin had been treated as reasonable suspicion. Internal emails recovered during discovery showed that supervisors were not only aware of Kessler's methods, but had actively endorsed them, describing his approach as proactive enforcement, in language that treated racial profiling as a job well done. Peretti's records completed the picture. He had been present for the majority of those stops. He had never filed a single objection. And on 11 separate occasions that later resulted in formal complaints, his body camera had mysteriously not been activated. The pattern wasn't a coincidence. It was a partnership built on silence, complicity, and the shared belief that no one would ever care enough to look. The federal grand jury returned its indictments 6 weeks after the incident, and the charges landed like a bomb across every level of federal law enforcement. Bryce Kessler was indicted on deprivation of rights under color of law under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, assault, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. Each charge carried the weight of years in federal prison. Dominic Peretti was indicted on conspiracy, failure to intervene in an unlawful use of force, and filing a false report. That last charge was particularly damning because the processing paperwork Peretti had completed at the facility described Nadine Achebe Coleman, a sitting federal judge with 11 years on the bench, as uncooperative, no valid ID, possible undocumented. Every word on that form was a fabrication, and Peretti had signed his name to it. 2 supervisors at the field office were also charged with conspiracy for enabling years of racially targeted enforcement, for reading the complaints and the internal reports and the emails describing Kessler's methods as proactive enforcement, and choosing to do nothing except let him keep going. The indictment sent shockwaves through the agency. ICE headquarters issued a carefully worded public statement, distancing itself from the agents, calling their actions inconsistent with the values of the organization. Language so hollow that even sympathetic commentators called it insulting. More telling was what happened with the union. Federal law enforcement unions almost always defended their members, almost always provided legal representation, almost always circled the wagons regardless of what the evidence showed. But after the body cam audio leaked publicly, after the country heard Kessler's voice saying a federal judge buying fruit, "Sure, sweetheart," after millions of people listened to him tell Peretti, they all say something like that, the union quietly declined to represent him. When even the people whose job it was to protect you decided you were too toxic to stand beside, the verdict was already written. The trial was just a formality. The criminal trial lasted 4 weeks, and from the first hour of the first day, it was clear there would be only one outcome. Prosecutors opened by playing the body camera footage from both agents simultaneously, on split screens mounted in the courtroom. The jury watched Kessler approach Nadine at the peach stand. They watched him grab her arm. They watched him drive her into the table. They heard the legs collapse. They heard her hit the ground. They watched Peretti zip-tie her wrists while she lay face down on the pavement, stating her name, her title, and her court. Then prosecutors played the audio from the SUV. The courtroom was silent as Kessler's voice filled the room. A federal judge buying fruit. "Sure, sweetheart." And then Peretti's laugh. Colonel Osai took the stand and his phone footage was played alongside the Bodycam angles, creating a synchronized three-perspective reconstruction that left the jury watching the same assault from every direction, with no place for their eyes to escape what had happened. Goldie Hartwell testified she had told both agents repeatedly that Nadine was a judge and a regular customer who came every Saturday. Inez Carrillo testified she had identified Nadine by full name and court from the edge of the crowd. Expert witnesses testified that no probable cause existed, that no active warrant matched Nadine's description, and that the agents had no lawful authority to detain her under any statute. Then Kessler took the stand. His attorney put him there believing he could project the calm professionalism of a veteran agent following procedure. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Under cross-examination, Kessler could not name the suspect he had supposedly been looking for that morning. He could not explain why he had targeted a 54-year-old woman when the bulletin described a male in his mid-20s. He could not justify the force used against a cooperative subject. He stumbled. He contradicted his own report. He contradicted the Bodycam footage playing on the screen behind him. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. Guilty on all counts for Kessler. Guilty on all counts for Peretti. Neither man showed emotion as the verdicts were read, but Kessler's hands were shaking. The sentencing hearing was standing room only. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters lined the back wall. Federal officials sat in the front row. And when Judge Nadine Achebe Coleman stood to read her victim impact statement, the courtroom went so quiet you could hear the scratch of the court reporter's keys. She spoke for 7 minutes. She described what it felt like to be thrown face first onto pavement by agents of the same government she had sworn an oath to serve. She described the sound of the zip tie clicking tight around her wrists. She described Kessler's voice in the SUV, the casual cruelty of a man who found her dignity amusing. She described the holding cell, the metal bench, the fluorescent lights, the silence of 3 other women who looked at her bruises and said nothing because they had learned that speaking changed nothing. She described coming home that evening and watching her 2 adult children see the scrape on her face and the purple bruises circling her wrists. She described her daughter's expression, the shock, the anger, the grief of realizing that her mother's robe and title and lifetime of service could not protect her from the thing they had always feared. Then Nadine looked directly at Kessler and spoke the words that would be quoted in every newspaper in the country the following morning. "I have spent my career upholding the Constitution. That morning, 2 men in badges decided the Constitution did not apply to me because of the color of my skin." The judge presiding over the sentencing held nothing back. He called Kessler's actions a stain on every officer who serves honorably, and a betrayal of the oath that should mean something. Kessler was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Peretti received 4. The 2 supervisors who had enabled years of racially targeted enforcement received 2 and 3 years respectively. Kessler's law enforcement certification was permanently revoked. He would never carry a badge again. The civil suit was filed in federal court against Kessler, Peretti, both supervisors, the field office, and the Department of Homeland Security itself. Nadine's legal team laid out the full scope of what had been done to her with the kind of meticulous, devastating precision that left no corner of the agency untouched. Physical assault, false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, racial profiling, systemic failure of oversight, reputational harm to a sitting member of the federal judiciary. Each claim was supported by body camera footage, witness testimony, medical records, and the processing paperwork that Peretti had signed, describing a federal judge as possible undocumented. But it was discovery that delivered the final blow. Internal DHS memos recovered during the process revealed that senior officials had acknowledged what they called overly aggressive field tactics in the region, more than 2 years before Kessler ever touched Nadine at that farmer's market. The memos documented complaints. They referenced patterns. They recommended review. And then, nothing happened. No corrective action was taken. No retraining was ordered. No agents were reassigned. The system saw the problem, wrote it down, filed it away, and allowed it to continue until it destroyed a woman's Saturday morning and her faith that the government she served would treat her as a citizen. The case settled for $32 million, one of the largest individual civil rights settlements in federal law enforcement history. But the money was only part of it. The settlement mandated sweeping structural reforms across ICE field operations, mandatory documented probable cause before any street stop, independent civilian oversight with real investigative authority, real-time body camera review protocols with consequences for non-compliance, and the creation of a rapid verification system allowing individuals who claimed government credentials during enforcement encounters to be confirmed on the spot before any detention could proceed. $32 million and a blueprint for making sure no one would ever have to prove they were a federal judge from the back of a holding cell again. Nadine Achebe Coleman returned to the federal bench on a Monday morning 6 months later. When she walked into her courtroom, every person in the gallery rose. The standing ovation lasted nearly 2 minutes. She said nothing. She sat down, opened the first case file, and went back to work. She used a portion of her settlement to establish the Coleman Achebe Justice Initiative, a foundation providing free legal defense to victims of unlawful immigration enforcement who didn't have a title or attorneys waiting in a parking lot. People who were zip-tied and never made the news. People who disappeared into facilities and had no voice loud enough to make the system care. Colonel Osei's footage became part of mandatory federal training materials distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide. Every new ICE agent would watch that video during orientation and be told the 2 men who did it were serving federal sentences. Goldie Hartwell returned to her stand with a hand-painted sign, "All are welcome here." Kessler served his sentence in a federal facility where his former profession made him a permanent target. He never apologized. He never acknowledged wrongdoing. He maintained until the end that the system had turned on him for political reasons. Peretti wrote a letter to Nadine from prison. She received it. She never opened it. The following summer, on a Saturday morning almost exactly 1 year later, Nadine walked through the same farmer's market on Briarcliff Lane. Linen blouse, sunglasses, canvas tote. She stopped at Goldie's stand, squeezed the peaches the way her mother taught her, and bought a bag. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned whether she belonged. For every case like this where power, evidence, and courage converge, there are thousands where they don't. But each one that ends in accountability makes the next one harder to ignore. And somewhere in Virginia, a federal judge is buying peaches on a Saturday morning. Uninterrupted. The way it always should have been. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.
Federal agents!
This is my mother's funeral.
You think hiding in a church makes you untouchable?
I am a United States District Judge. You have no warrant.
We don't care who you say you are.
At 11:47 a.m. inside Grace Covenant Baptist Church, 4 ICE agents in tactical vests burst through the double doors and stormed down the center aisle during a funeral eulogy. The pastor stopped mid-sentence. Mourners turned in their pews. A woman in the third row pulled her grandchild close. The agents moved in formation, boots heavy on the worn hardwood, past the flower arrangements, past the framed photographs on easels, past 200 people dressed in black who had come to say goodbye to a 79-year-old woman named Estelle Drayton. They didn't stop until they reached the front pew, where a black man in a dark suit stood with one hand resting on the open casket. His mother's casket. The lead agent grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around. "Federal agents, don't move!" The man didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice. He said, "This is a funeral." It didn't matter. Two agents forced his arms behind his back while a third drove him forward. His knees hit the floor first, then his chest, then the side of his face, pressed flat against the hardwood between the first and second pews. The sound echoed through the sanctuary. His 82-year-old aunt screamed from 3 rows back and collapsed into the arms of the woman beside her. His teenage niece stood frozen, mouth open, tears already falling. The pastor rushed forward. "Stop this! This is a house of God! Stop this right now!" No one stopped. The agents cuffed him on the floor of his mother's church, 6 feet from her body, while 200 mourners watched and a live stream camera recorded every second. The man on the ground was Federal Judge Nathaniel Drayton, a sitting judge on the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. The agents had no warrant, no probable cause, and no idea what they had just done. Nathaniel Drayton was 54 years old. He grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in southeast Washington, D.C., the youngest of 3 children. His mother, Estelle, worked as a seamstress 6 days a week. His father, Robert, carried mail for the Postal Service for 34 years and never missed a shift. Neither of them had attended college, but both of them made sure their children understood that education was not optional. Nathaniel was the first in his family to earn a degree. He graduated from Morehouse College, then Howard University School of Law, where he finished in the top 5 of his class. He clerked for a federal appeals court judge, spent 8 years as a public defender representing people who couldn't afford attorneys, then crossed to the other side and became an assistant United States attorney. At 43, he was nominated to the federal bench by the President of the United States. The Senate confirmed him with bipartisan support. For 11 years, Judge Drayton had served on the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. He was known for 3 things: fairness, precision, and an unwavering reverence for constitutional protections. Attorneys who appeared before him, regardless of which side they represented, described him the same way: demanding but fair. He didn't tolerate laziness. He didn't tolerate theatrics. And he did not tolerate any agent of the government exercising power without legal authority. At the time of his mother's funeral, Judge Drayton was presiding over one of the most closely watched immigration cases in the country, a class action challenge to federal detention practices that had drawn national attention and put him directly at odds with the enforcement arm of the Department of Homeland Security. That detail would become critically important. The man who gave the order was Dominic Voss. He was 43 years old and had spent 16 years with Homeland Security investigations, climbing through the ranks not because of careful judgment or legal precision, but because he produced numbers. His supervisors called him a man who gets results. That phrase appeared in 3 separate performance reviews and was used each time to justify looking the other way. Over the course of his career, Voss had accumulated 7 excessive force complaints, 4 civil rights grievances filed by immigrant advocacy organizations, and 2 internal investigations that were opened with urgency and closed without explanation. None of it slowed his rise. None of it triggered reassignment. He learned the same lesson every year: results mattered more than rights. His team that morning consisted of 3 agents. Kyle Rennick, 36, had worked under Voss for 4 years and never once questioned an order. He did what he was told, wrote what he was told to write, and kept his mouth shut. Sean Pollard, 31, was the youngest on the team. He had been with ICE for just under 3 years and was still early enough in his career to feel the weight of what they did. During the arrest at the church, his body language told a different story than the others. He hesitated at the door. He hung back in the aisle. He said nothing. Terrence Nolan, 39, had transferred from Border Patrol 2 years earlier, bringing with him his own history of complaints involving excessive force against detained migrants, none of which had followed him into his new file. The morning of the funeral, Voss briefed his team in the parking lot of a gas station 3 blocks from the church. He told them he had received a tip that a man connected to an immigration fugitive case would be present at a gathering at Grace Covenant Baptist. He didn't name the source. He didn't provide a photograph. He didn't confirm the identity of the individual. He didn't obtain a warrant. He saw a black man standing at the front of the church beside a casket and decided that was enough. The church had been live streaming the funeral for family members who couldn't travel. Estelle Drayton had touched many lives over 79 years, and more than 200 people were watching remotely from living rooms, hospital beds, and military postings overseas when the agents came through the doors. The church's own security system added 2 more angles, one from the back of the sanctuary facing the altar, another from a side-mounted camera near the choir loft. At least 7 mourners inside the church pulled out their phones the moment the shouting started. Together, the footage captured everything. It captured Judge Drayton standing at the front pew with his right hand resting on the edge of his mother's casket, his lips moving quietly, saying something only she was meant to hear. It captured 4 agents in tactical vests, shoving past elderly women in the center aisle, one of whom stumbled into a pew and grabbed a stranger's arm to keep from falling. It captured the lead agent seizing Drayton by the shoulder, and the moment his face struck the hardwood floor. It captured his 82-year-old aunt, seated 3 rows back, clutching her chest and collapsing sideways into the arms of the woman beside her. It captured his teenage niece, standing rigid, hands trembling, screaming a sound the audio picked up with perfect clarity. It captured the agents rifling through Drayton's suit jacket pockets while he lay cuffed and motionless on the floor of his mother's funeral. And it captured 2 specific statements that would be replayed millions of times in the days that followed. The first came from Agent Rennick, who was recorded saying, "Stop resisting," while Drayton lay completely still, his cheek flat against the wood, his arms locked behind his back, not moving a single muscle. The second came from Voss himself. When Drayton said his name and told them he was a federal judge, Voss leaned down and the microphone on the nearest phone picked up every word. "We don't care who you say you are." Drayton lay on the floor with his cheek pressed against the hardwood and his wrists locked behind his back. His breathing was controlled. His voice, when he spoke, carried no panic, no anger, only the measured clarity of a man who had spent decades choosing his words with precision. "My name is Nathaniel Drayton. I am a United States District Judge for the Eastern District of Virginia. This is my mother's funeral. You have no warrant." Voss, still crouched over him with one hand on Drayton's back, laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable exhale, a real laugh, caught on 3 separate recordings from 3 separate angles. "Sure you are, buddy." The pastor, Reverend Isaiah Holloway, stepped forward. His hands were shaking, but his steps were deliberate. He reached into the pew where Drayton's overcoat was folded and pulled out a leather credential case. He opened it and held it in front of Voss's face. The camera from the choir loft captured the moment perfectly. Voss's eyes moved to the ID. The seal of the United States District Court, the photograph, the name. His expression shifted. Not remorse, not shame. Recognition. The recognition of a man who had just realized the size of what he'd done. Rennick leaned in and whispered something. Pollard took a full step backward, his face draining of color. For 90 seconds, no one in the sanctuary moved. The live stream kept running. The phones kept recording. Then Voss, without removing the handcuffs, stood and keyed his radio. The response from the field office was immediate. Even through the low-quality radio audio, the tone was unmistakable. It was panic. The cuffs came off. Voss did not apologize. He straightened up, adjusted his vest, and said 5 words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "There's been a miscommunication." Drayton rose slowly from the floor. He brushed the dust from his suit jacket. He adjusted his tie. He turned and looked at his mother's casket. Then he said nothing. He stood in the center aisle of his mother's church, surrounded by 200 people holding their breath, and offered no words at all. His silence was more devastating than anything he could have said. The funeral could not be resumed. Reverend Holloway tried. He returned to the pulpit, gripped the edges with both hands, and opened his mouth to speak. No words came. He stood there for nearly 10 seconds before a deacon gently guided him to a chair. The sanctuary had become something other than a place of mourning. It had become a crime scene that no one had the authority to process. Estelle Drayton's casket had been bumped during the struggle. A spray of white lilies lay scattered across the floor, some of them crushed under boot prints. 2 of the flower arrangements near the altar had been knocked sideways. No one moved to pick them up. Drayton's Aunt Vivian, 82, was carried out through the side entrance by 2 relatives and a church usher. She was clutching her chest and struggling to breathe. An ambulance was called. She would spend the next 2 days in the cardiac unit at Riverside Memorial, diagnosed with stress-induced angina triggered by the shock of watching her nephew forced to the ground beside her sister's body. Drayton's niece, 16, sat in the second pew with her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. She had not stopped crying since the agents came through the doors. No one could reach her. Drayton's older sister Colleen stood near the side aisle and spoke through tears to a group of mourners that included 2 retired judges, 3 attorneys, a city council member, and the principal of the elementary school Estelle had volunteered at for 20 years. Our mother spent her whole life telling us the system would protect us. She believed that. She made us believe it. And they came into her church and put her son on the floor next to her casket. They desecrated her funeral. Drayton himself sat in the front pew. His suit was wrinkled where the cuffs had pulled the fabric. A small abrasion marked the left side of his face where it had struck the floor. He stared straight ahead at the casket. At his feet were the pages of the eulogy he had written. They had fallen from his jacket pocket during the arrest and been stepped on. He reached down slowly, picked them up one by one, folded them carefully, and placed them in his breast pocket. He never read them aloud. Estelle Drayton was buried later that afternoon in a private graveside service attended only by immediate family. There was no eulogy, there were no remarks. There was only silence and the sound of dirt hitting the lid of a casket that should have been honored inside the church where her son was put on the floor. Within 90 minutes, the footage was everywhere. The first clip to spread came from the church live stream itself. A family member watching from a military base in Germany had screen recorded the moment the agents entered the sanctuary and posted it with a single line. "They just arrested my uncle at my grandmother's funeral." The post was shared 4,000 times in the first 20 minutes. By the time the second and third clips surfaced, pulled from mourners' phones and uploaded with shaking hands and raw captions, the story had already crossed the threshold from incident to national crisis. The footage showed everything in sequence. A man in a dark suit standing beside his mother's open casket. Agents in tactical vests shoving through a church aisle. That same man face down on the hardwood floor, cuffed, motionless, while someone off camera screamed. When the detail emerged that the man on the ground was not just a grieving son, but a sitting United States District Judge, the outrage did not simply grow, it detonated. Legal communities across the country responded within hours. The Chief Judge of the Eastern District of Virginia released a rare public statement calling the arrest an unconscionable violation of judicial independence and basic human dignity. The National Bar Association issued a formal demand for an immediate federal investigation. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund called it one of the most disturbing abuses of federal power caught on camera in modern history. 3 separate congressional offices contacted the Department of Homeland Security before sundown, demanding a full briefing. By evening, cable news led every broadcast with the footage. The images played on loop. The casket. The floor. The cuffs. The flowers scattered across the hardwood. The headline wrote itself, and every network ran a version of the same words. ICE agents arrest black federal judge at mother's funeral without a warrant. By midnight, the footage had been viewed over 12 million times, and it was still climbing. That same evening, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Public Affairs Office released a 4-paragraph statement. It called the incident a case of mistaken identity that occurred during a lawful enforcement action. It stated that the agents involved were acting on credible intelligence and had followed established protocols consistent with agency guidelines. It expressed regret for any inconvenience caused and assured the public that a review was underway. Every material claim in the statement would later be proven false. The credible intelligence was a single anonymous phone call placed to the field office tip line. The caller was never identified. The call was never recorded. The content of the tip described a male of African American appearance, possibly connected to a fugitive immigration case. No name was given. No photograph was provided. No age, no height, no weight. The fugitive the agency later claimed the agents were pursuing was a 28-year-old man, 5'7", 150 pounds. Judge Drayton was 54, 6'2", and 210 pounds. The only physical characteristic they shared was the color of their skin. There was no warrant issued for the arrest. No probable cause had been established. No supervisor had signed off on the operation. Voss had briefed his team in a gas station parking lot and driven to a church where a funeral was in progress. The agency's statement did not mention that the location was a church. It did not mention that a funeral was taking place. It did not mention that the man who was detained was a federal judge. And when reporters followed up asking for the name of the individual, the basis for the intelligence, or the specific protocol that authorized entering a house of worship during a religious service, ICE declined to comment further. The silence told its own story. The federal response came fast and from multiple directions at once. Within 48 hours, the Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility opened a formal investigation into the conduct of all 4 agents. The Inspector General's office launched a parallel review of the field office that had authorized the operation. FBI agents from the Civil Rights Division were assigned to examine whether the arrest constituted a criminal violation of Judge Drayton's constitutional rights under color of law. But it was the United States Marshals Service that responded with the most visible anger. Federal marshals are responsible for the protection of the federal judiciary. Their mandate is to ensure that judges can carry out their duties free from intimidation, interference, and threat. The arrest of a sitting judge without a warrant inside a church during his mother's funeral represented a direct violation of everything the Marshals Service existed to prevent. Their public statement was unusually blunt. The warrantless arrest of a United States district judge constitutes a direct threat to the independence and safety of the federal judiciary. The U.S. Marshals Service takes this matter with the utmost seriousness and is cooperating fully with all ongoing investigations. Congress moved within the same window. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee demanded a classified briefing from the Department of Homeland Security. 3 members of the House called publicly for the agents to face criminal charges. A 4th introduced a resolution condemning the arrest and calling for an independent review of ICE enforcement actions at houses of worship. Inside ICE headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted from damage control to institutional survival. Internal emails, later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed senior officials scrambling to manage what they already knew could not be managed. One email, sent from a deputy director to the agency's chief counsel at 9:47 p.m. on the night of the arrest, read, "This is the worst-case scenario. A sitting judge, at a funeral, on live stream. There is no good version of this story." No one replied to that email. There was nothing to say. Investigators from the FBI and the Inspector General's office interviewed all 4 agents separately over the following week. Each agent was questioned in a closed room without the others present and asked to provide a detailed account of the planning, execution, and justification for the arrest. Their stories fell apart almost immediately. On the most basic question, who gave the order to enter the church, the answers diverged. Voss said the decision was made collectively, based on the intelligence briefing. Rennick said Voss gave a direct verbal order in the vehicle. Nolan said Rennick confirmed the go-ahead. Pollard said no one explicitly said go, that Voss simply opened his door and the rest followed. On the question of whether they identified themselves as federal agents before making physical contact with Drayton, Voss claimed they did. Rennick said he believed Voss announced himself at the door. The footage from 4 separate recordings showed no announcement of any kind. On the question of resistance, Voss stated that Drayton had been non-compliant and physically aggressive, and had attempted to pull away. Every second of video evidence showed the exact opposite. Drayton had not moved. He had not raised his voice. He had not tensed his body. He had stood still, spoken calmly, and been taken to the floor without provocation. Rennick, asked whether he heard Drayton identify himself as a federal judge, said he had not. 3 separate audio recordings placed him 4 feet away at the moment Drayton said his full name and title. The microphones picked up Rennick's breathing. He was close enough to hear every word. Pollard broke first. Under sustained questioning on the second day, the youngest agent admitted that he had known something was wrong from the moment they pulled into the church parking lot and saw the hearse. He said Voss never showed them a warrant because there was no warrant. He said no one discussed probable cause, and he disclosed that during the drive to the church, Voss had made comments about these people, thinking they could hide behind churches, and that it was time to remind them the law doesn't stop at the door. Nolan's interview uncovered a separate problem entirely. Investigators discovered he had been involved in 2 prior warrantless arrests during his time with Border Patrol, neither of which had been reported or reviewed. Internal records pulled during the investigation showed that Voss's own complaint history, 7 excessive force grievances and 2 internal investigations, had been flagged for supervisory review on 3 occasions. Each time, the file was closed without action by the same field office director. That director was now under investigation himself. 1 week after his mother's funeral, Judge Nathaniel Drayton stood behind a podium on the steps of the federal courthouse where he had served for 11 years. He wore a dark suit, a pressed white shirt, and no expression that betrayed what the past 7 days had cost him. Behind him stood his sister Colleen, his niece, 2 attorneys, and a row of colleagues from the bench who had come not to speak, but to stand. The press conference was carried live on 4 cable networks and streamed by dozens of outlets. Drayton did not read from prepared remarks. He spoke from memory, the way he conducted proceedings in his courtroom, precise, unhurried, and without a single wasted word. He began with the facts. He stated the date, the time, the location. He named the church. He named his mother. He described the sequence of events the way a judge would enter findings into the record, each detail stripped of emotion and laid bare in clinical order. The agents entered during the eulogy. They did not identify themselves. They did not present a warrant. They made physical contact without verbal warning. He was placed face down on the floor and handcuffed beside his mother's open casket. Then he paused. He looked directly into the cameras and spoke about Estelle Drayton. He described a woman who worked as a seamstress 6 days a week and cleaned offices on the 7th. A woman who raised 3 children in a 2-bedroom apartment and never once let them believe the world owed them anything. A woman who lived long enough to watch her youngest son sworn in as a federal judge and who died still believing that the law existed to protect everyone equally. They put me on the floor of my mother's church, he said, beside her body, in front of her friends and her grandchildren. They did not ask my name. They did not present a warrant. They saw a black man and decided he was guilty of something. That is not law enforcement. That is the precise injustice the Constitution was amended to prevent. He announced that he had retained counsel and was filing a federal civil rights lawsuit against the 4 agents individually, their supervising field office director, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, and the Department of Homeland Security. He took no questions. He stepped away from the podium and walked back into the courthouse. The doors closed behind him. The cameras kept rolling on the empty steps. What came next, changed everything. During the discovery phase of Judge Drayton's federal civil rights lawsuit, his legal team issued subpoenas for the complete internal communications of the ICE field office that had directed the operation. What they found did not simply strengthen the case, it dismantled the entire narrative ICE had constructed and replaced it with something far darker than misconduct or incompetence. The agency had claimed mistaken identity. The evidence showed premeditation. Buried in the records was a series of text messages between Dominic Voss and a fellow agent at the field office sent over the 48 hours preceding the arrest. In one exchange from the evening before the funeral, Voss wrote 7 words that would become the centerpiece of the federal prosecution. "Gonna be at that church tomorrow. Let's see how tough he is off the bench." The recipient replied with a single emoji. Neither agent reported the exchange. Neither flagged it for supervisory review. The message made one thing undeniable. Voss knew who Nathaniel Drayton was. He knew Drayton was a federal judge. And he knew Drayton was presiding over the immigration detention case in which ICE was a named party. A case that had generated significant internal frustration within the agency after Drayton issued a series of rulings restricting the conditions under which detainees could be held. The anonymous tip that Voss had cited as the basis for the operation was traced during discovery to a prepaid phone linked to a registered ICE informant. When investigators contacted the informant, he confirmed he had been asked to make the call by someone inside the field office. He had no knowledge of any fugitive connected to the church. He had never heard the name Nathaniel Drayton. He was told to call the tip line and report a male of African American appearance at Grace Covenant Baptist Church on the day of the funeral. He was not told why. The implication was no longer a matter of interpretation. The arrest of Judge Drayton had not been a mistake. It had not been a case of bad intelligence or poor judgment. It had been a deliberate, coordinated act of retaliation against a sitting federal judge for rulings that ICE disagreed with. It constituted obstruction of justice, intimidation of a federal official, and a direct assault on the independence of the judiciary. And every piece of evidence had come from the agency's own records. The federal grand jury convened for 6 days. They reviewed the video evidence from the church, the body camera footage from the U.S. Marshals who responded to secure the courthouse after the incident, the text messages recovered during discovery, the phone records linking the anonymous tip to an ICE informant, and the testimony of 14 witnesses including Agent Sean Pollard, who had agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors. When the indictments were returned, they came down on all 4 agents and the field office director who had supervised them. Dominic Voss faced the heaviest charges: conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law, deprivation of rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, making false statements to federal investigators, and retaliatory action against a federal official. A charge that carried particular weight because it meant prosecutors believed the arrest was not an accident, but a deliberate act designed to punish a judge for his rulings. Kyle Rennick and Terrence Nolan were each charged with conspiracy to deprive civil rights and deprivation of rights under color of law. The evidence showed they had participated knowingly in an operation that had no warrant, no probable cause, and no lawful basis. Pollard, who had broken during his interview and provided the most damaging testimony against Voss, was offered a reduced plea agreement in exchange for his continued cooperation. He accepted. The field office director, Raymond Cahill, 56, who had overseen Voss for the past 4 years, was charged with conspiracy and failure to supervise. Investigators had documented 3 separate occasions on which complaints against Voss had been flagged for Cahill's review. Each time, the file was closed with no action, no interview, no disciplinary note. Cahill had signed off on each closure personally. At Voss's arraignment, the federal magistrate set bail at $500,000. The amount drew immediate attention. For a federal agent with no prior convictions, it was unusually high, a signal that the court viewed the charges as exceptionally serious. Voss's attorney objected on the record, calling the prosecution politically motivated and designed to make an example of a dedicated public servant. The magistrate looked at him for a long moment before responding. Your client arrested a sitting United States District Judge at his mother's funeral without a warrant. The political motivation, if any, appears to have been on his side. Voss posted bail that evening. He did not speak to reporters. He was placed on indefinite, unpaid suspension by the agency the following morning. His credentials were confiscated. His service weapon was surrendered. For the first time in 16 years, Dominic Voss had no badge, no authority, and no one willing to look the other way. The trial began on a Monday morning in the same federal courthouse where Judge Drayton had presided for 11 years. A different judge had been assigned to the case, brought in from the Western District to avoid any conflict. The courtroom was full before the doors opened. Prosecutors began with the footage. The live stream recording played on 2 large monitors positioned so that every juror, every spectator, and every defendant in the room could see it clearly. The video ran for 4 minutes and 38 seconds. It began with the church doors opening and ended with Voss saying, "There's been a miscommunication." 3 jurors visibly reacted during the first minute. One covered her mouth, another looked away and then forced herself to look back. A third stared straight at Voss, seated at the defense table, and did not look away for the rest of the playback. Over 4 weeks, prosecutors called 31 witnesses. Mourners described what they saw and heard inside the sanctuary. Fellow judges from the Eastern District testified about Judge Drayton's reputation, his judicial temperament, and the immigration case he had been presiding over. ICE whistleblowers. 2 analysts who had worked in the same field office testified that Voss had openly expressed frustration with Drayton's rulings in the detention case, and had referred to the judge using language they described as racially charged. Digital forensics experts authenticated the text messages, confirmed the phone records, and traced the anonymous tip to the ICE informant's prepaid device, with certainty that left no room for dispute. Voss took the stand in his own defense during the 3rd week. His attorney guided him through a version of events in which every action was justified, every decision was procedural, and every outcome was an unfortunate misunderstanding. He used the phrase "following protocol" 4 times in his opening answers. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor asked him to name the specific protocol that authorized entering a house of worship during a funeral service without a warrant. Voss could not name it. The prosecutor asked him to produce the warrant. There was no warrant. The prosecutor asked him to explain the text message sent the night before the arrest. Voss said he did not recall the context. The prosecutor displayed the message on the courtroom monitor and read it aloud. "Gonna be at that church tomorrow. Let's see how tough he is off the bench." Voss stared at the screen and said nothing. The prosecutor then asked him to explain how the fugitive he claimed to be pursuing was 28 years old, 5'7", and 150 pounds, while the man he arrested was 54, 6'2", and 210 pounds. Voss said the description he received was vague. The prosecutor replied, "The only thing vague about your description was everything except the race." The jury was sent to deliberate on a Thursday afternoon. They returned Friday morning. Guilty on all counts for Dominic Voss. Guilty on all counts for Kyle Rennick. Guilty on all counts for Terrence Nolan. Guilty on the conspiracy charge for Raymond Cahill. Sentencing followed 6 weeks later. Voss received 7 years in federal prison. Rennick received 4 years. Nolan received 3 years and 6 months. Cahill received 2 years. All 4 had their law enforcement certifications permanently revoked. None would ever carry a badge again. The civil lawsuit settled before trial. The Department of Homeland Security, facing the same video evidence that had convicted its agents, the same text messages, the same phone records, and the same testimony from its own informant, chose not to take the case before a jury. The settlement was $4.6 million, one of the largest individual civil rights settlements ever reached against a federal law enforcement agency. The money alone would have made headlines, but the terms that accompanied it carried more weight than the dollar figure. The agreement included sweeping mandatory reforms imposed on the field office and extending to agency-wide policy review. Independent civilian oversight of all ICE enforcement actions involving houses of worship, with quarterly audits and public reporting. Mandatory warrant verification procedures requiring supervisory sign-off and documented probable cause before any arrest operation could be initiated. A zero-tolerance policy for retaliatory actions against judicial officials, with automatic referral to the Inspector General for any complaint involving a member of the federal judiciary. The creation of a civilian review board with investigative authority over complaints filed against the field office, staffed by attorneys and civil rights professionals appointed independently of the agency. And a requirement that all prior complaints against agents involved in use of force incidents be reviewed and documented before those agents could be cleared for field operations. Judge Drayton donated a significant portion of the settlement to establish the Estelle Drayton Justice Fund. The fund provided legal representation to immigrants and citizens whose civil rights were violated by federal agents, specifically targeting cases where victims lack the resources or visibility to fight back on their own. The fund was administered by a board that included civil rights attorneys, community advocates, and 2 retired federal judges. Within its first year, it had taken on 40 cases. Drayton returned to the bench 3 months after the settlement was finalized. His first day back, the courtroom was full before the bailiff opened the doors. Attorneys, clerks, fellow judges, journalists, and members of the public filled every seat and lined the back wall. When Drayton entered in his robes, the room went still. He sat down, arranged his papers, and looked out across the courtroom. He did not reference the case. He did not reference the arrest. He paused for a moment and then spoke. "The law failed me on the worst day of my life. But I am still here, and so is the law. My mother believed that. I still believe that." He picked up his gavel. The courtroom was silent. Then he began. Back at Grace Covenant Baptist Church, a small bronze plaque was installed on the wall beside the front pew. It was paid for by the congregation and unveiled during a Sunday service attended by over 300 people.
Let me see your identification, now.
I am Brigadier General Solomon Drayton, United States Army. What agency are you with, and do you have a warrant?
Uniform doesn't mean anything to me. We both know people dress up to look official.
This is my home. You are required to state your authority.
You fit the...
At 6:40 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Fayetteville, North Carolina, Brigadier General Solomon Drayton stepped out of his front door in full Army Class A dress uniform. He was 54 years old, a 30-year decorated combat veteran, and the deputy commander of Fort Liberty's 18th Airborne Corps. The ribbons on his chest told a story most people would never fully understand. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, 3 overseas deployments, 2 combat commands, a career built on discipline, precision, and sacrifice. That morning, he was heading to a promotion ceremony on post, where he would pin a star on a fellow officer and friend. It was supposed to be a proud day. Inside the house, his wife, Dr. Nadine Drayton, a neurologist at Cape Fear Valley Medical Center, stood at the kitchen window with a coffee mug in her hand, watching him walk toward the car. Their 16-year-old daughter, Amara, was upstairs getting ready for school, backpack half-packed on her bed. The street was quiet. Sprinklers clicked across lawns. A neighbor's dog barked once and stopped. Then 3 black SUVs turned the corner in a tight formation, moved down the block without slowing, and came to a hard stop across the Drayton driveway. The engines stayed running. The doors opened all at once, and Solomon Drayton, a general officer in the United States Army, stood alone on his own front lawn, watching 8 federal agents step out in tactical gear with their hands already on their weapons. The team was led by ICE Supervisory Agent Victor Pollard, 43 years old, 16 years in federal law enforcement. Pollard had built a career on aggressive field operations and high-volume arrest numbers. Inside his agency, he was known for running his teams hard and fast, often in neighborhoods where the residents were Black or Latino. He had 11 prior complaints of excessive force and racial targeting in his personnel file. Every single one had been internally reviewed and cleared. His supervisors described him in evaluations as intense but effective. Officers who had worked under him used different words. His second that morning was Agent Craig Fenton, 36, 6 years on the job. Fenton had never once filed a dissenting report. He backed Pollard's calls without question, co-signed every use of force narrative, and stayed quiet when others raised concerns. He was the kind of agent who followed rather than thought, the kind whose silence made everything worse. Their team of 6 additional agents exited the SUVs in full tactical gear, ballistic vests, sidearms drawn, boots on a suburban sidewalk at sunrise. Not one of them had activated a body camera. Department policy required recording during all enforcement operations. Pollard's teams had failed to comply with that policy on more than 40 documented occasions, nearly all of them in communities of color. No one had ever been disciplined for it. That pattern would matter later. But in that moment, standing on a quiet residential street in front of a general's home, the cameras were dark, the weapons were out, and the agents were moving toward the driveway like they had already decided how this was going to end. Pollard reached the driveway first. He didn't introduce himself, didn't show credentials, didn't explain why 8 armed agents were standing on a private lawn at sunrise. He looked Drayton up and down, eyes passing over the ribbons, the rank insignia, the pressed uniform, and none of it registered as relevant. He spoke like a man who had done this 100 times before. "I need to see identification." Drayton's posture didn't shift. His voice was calm, measured, the tone of someone who had commanded thousands of soldiers under far worse pressure than this. "I'm Brigadier General Solomon Drayton, United States Army. This is my home. What agency are you with, and do you have a warrant?" Pollard ignored both questions. "Turn around." Drayton didn't move. He held eye contact. "Sir, I've asked you a direct question. Do you have a warrant?" Fenton stepped around to Drayton's left side, closing the space behind him without a word. 2 more agents fanned out across the lawn. Drayton stayed still. He could feel the positioning. He understood what it meant. Across the street, retired Marine Colonel Edwin Hargrove, 71, white, a combat veteran who had served 3 tours in Vietnam, stepped out onto his front porch in a bathrobe and slippers. He saw the SUVs, the tactical gear, the drawn weapons, and a man in army dress blues standing alone against all of it. He pulled out his phone and began recording. Upstairs in the Drayton home, Amara had moved to the window. She pressed her phone to the glass, hands trembling, and hit record. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The image spoke for itself. Her father, in full uniform, surrounded on his own property by men who hadn't even told him why they were there. Pollard finally offered something resembling an explanation, but only after Drayton asked a 3rd time. "We have an administrative warrant for an individual at this address." Drayton's expression didn't change. "What name is on the warrant?" Pollard glanced at a folded document in his hand. The name he read out loud did not belong to anyone in the Drayton household, had never belonged to anyone at that address. Drayton said so immediately. "That person does not live here. I've owned this home for 9 years. I can show you my military ID and the deed." He reached slowly toward his breast pocket. Pollard's hand moved to his sidearm. "Don't reach for anything." Drayton froze. "I'm reaching for my identification, that's all." Pollard shook his head. "We'll sort it out downtown. You're coming with us." Drayton's voice stayed level, but the edge was there now. "I am not going anywhere without a warrant bearing my name. That is my right." For a moment, no one moved. Then Pollard grabbed Drayton's right arm. Fenton seized the left. The motion was fast, coordinated, practiced. They drove him forward and down. A 1-star general in full-dress uniform hit the concrete of his own driveway, face first. The sound was a dull crack, followed by the scrape of metal on pavement as his metals dragged across the surface. His cap rolled off and came to rest in the grass. His chin split on impact. Blood spotted the concrete beneath his face. Drayton did not resist. He did not swing. He did not shout. He lay still with his arms pulled behind his back and said 5 words, loud enough for every camera and every neighbor now stepping outside to hear. I am not resisting arrest. The front door slammed open. Nadine Drayton came down the steps barefoot, coffee mug abandoned somewhere behind her. She saw her husband face down on the driveway, 2 agents kneeling over him, blood on the concrete beneath his chin. She screamed his name. 2 agents stepped into her path before she reached the bottom step. Their bodies formed a wall on her own porch. Nadine's voice broke through the morning air, sharp enough to carry across the block. "That is my husband! Show me a warrant! Give me your badge numbers and your names right now!" The agent closest to her leaned in and lowered his voice. "Go back inside before this gets worse for your husband." The threat was quiet and deliberate, and Amara's phone caught every word from the upstairs window. The 16-year-old was sobbing, hands shaking so badly the footage would later show a constant tremor across the frame. But she didn't stop recording. She watched her father, a general who had led soldiers through combat, lying face down on his own driveway, with his dress uniform grinding into the pavement. Drayton heard his wife's voice. He heard the fear in it. He heard his daughter crying above him. And from the concrete, with blood running down his chin and both arms pinned behind his back, he spoke. "Nadine, Amara, stay calm. I'm okay. Do not come outside." His voice was steady, the voice of a man trained to lead under fire. But the cameras caught what his tone tried to hide: the blood on his face, the torn fabric at his shoulder, and the expression of a father who could not protect his family from the people standing on his own lawn. Colonel Edwin Hargrove crossed the street in his bathrobe with his phone held steady at chest height. He walked with the unhurried pace of a man who had spent decades in places far more dangerous than a suburban sidewalk. He stopped at the edge of the driveway and spoke clearly. "I'm Colonel Edwin Hargrove, United States Marine Corps, retired. I am recording this interaction. I want to know what authority you're operating under and whether you have a warrant for this man." Pollard didn't look up from where he knelt on Drayton's back. "Sir, step away or you'll be charged with obstruction." Hargrove didn't move, not 1 inch. "That man is a brigadier general in the United States Army. He is a flag officer in the armed forces. You are making a career-ending mistake." Pollard looked up then. His expression was hard, dismissive. "I don't care if he's the president. He fits the description." The words landed in the open air, where every phone microphone within 50 feet picked them up. Hargrove's recording captured Pollard's face as he said it, captured the knee still pressing into a general's back, captured the metals flat against the driveway. Down the block, doors were opening. A woman 2 houses east stood on her porch with her phone raised. A man walking his dog stopped at the corner filming. A teenager in a parked car had his window down and his camera pointed at the scene. Within minutes, there were 9 civilian recordings from 7 different angles, and every single one showed the same thing. A black man in full military dress uniform, pinned to his own property by armed agents who had no warrant with his name on it and no intention of letting him explain. Pollard stood Drayton up by the cuffs. The motion was rough, deliberate. Drayton's uniform was torn at the right shoulder where the fabric had caught against the concrete. The ribbons on his chest were scuffed. The bronze star sat crooked against the Purple Heart. Blood had dried along his jawline in a thin, dark line. Pollard walked him to the rear SUV and opened the back door. Drayton ducked his head and sat without a word. He didn't look back at his house. He didn't need to. He knew Nadine was watching. He knew Amara was still at the window. Fenton climbed into the passenger seat. The SUV pulled out of the driveway and turned east toward the federal processing facility across the city. Through the rear window, Drayton's ribbons were still visible, pinned to the chest of a man who had earned every one of them in places most of these agents would never see. On the front steps, Nadine stood with both hands shaking. The agents who had blocked her were walking back to the remaining vehicles. No one offered an explanation. No one left a card. She pulled out her phone and dialed Fort Liberty's Provost Marshal office. Then she called their attorney. Her voice cracked once on the second call, and then steadied. They just took my husband off our property in handcuffs. He's a brigadier general. They had no warrant with his name on it. The SUV was already 3 miles away. A general sat in the back seat behind tinted glass, and there was not a single piece of paperwork anywhere in that vehicle that justified his presence in it. The Federal Processing Facility was a low, gray building with fluorescent lighting and the smell of disinfectant in every hallway. Drayton was walked through a side entrance, still in cuffs, still in his torn dress uniform. The intake officer looked at him, looked at the ribbons, looked at the rank on his shoulders, and said nothing. He was placed in a holding cell with a metal bench and a steel door. No phone call, no explanation of charges, no access to counsel. 3 hours passed. Drayton sat with his back straight and his hands folded, the same posture he held in briefing rooms and command meetings. He asked twice to contact his chain of command. Both times the request was ignored. The third time, a supervising agent passing the cell stopped and looked in through the narrow window. Drayton spoke clearly. "I am Brigadier General Solomon Drayton, United States Army. I need to contact my command immediately." The agent smirked. "Everyone in here says there's somebody." He kept walking. But somewhere in the building, protocol was finally catching up with what Pollard had set in motion. Drayton's fingerprints had been scanned at intake. His military ID had been entered into the system. The results came back in seconds. Active duty flag officer. Deputy Commander, 18th Airborne Corps. Top secret/SCI security clearance. No outstanding warrants, no criminal record. 30 years of service. The intake officer read the screen twice. Then he picked up the phone and called his supervisor. The supervisor came down the hall at a pace just short of running. He looked through the cell window at a man in a torn dress uniform sitting perfectly still on a metal bench. And for the first time since the SUVs had rolled up to that driveway, the room went quiet. Nadine's call reached the Fort Liberty Provost Marshal at 7:14 a.m. By 7:22, the 18th Airborne Corps Command Duty Officer had been notified. By 7:35, the Army's Office of the Staff Judge Advocate was on a secure line with the Corps Chief of Staff. The words were simple. "One of our flag officers has been detained by federal agents at his home without a valid warrant." Within the hour, NCIS was looped in because of the joint service implications. The Pentagon's Office of General Counsel was alerted shortly after. A JAG colonel named David Sumner picked up his phone at Fort Liberty and dialed the ICE field office directly. His tone was not a request. "I'm calling on behalf of the 18th Airborne Corps regarding the unlawful detention of Brigadier General Solomon Drayton. You will release him immediately." The field office supervisor pulled up the arrest file while still on the line. What he found was what anyone who had looked from the beginning would have found. No valid warrant for Solomon Drayton. No matching name. No probable cause. The warrant listed a different individual who had never been associated with the Drayton household or that address. The supervisor asked how Drayton had been brought in. When told the details, he went silent. Then he asked if body cameras had been activated. No. Witnesses? Multiple. Was the general injured? Yes. He set the phone down, walked into his office, and closed the door. The panic that followed was quiet but absolute, because every person in that building now understood that what had happened that morning was not a procedural error. It was a federal incident. Drayton was released at 10:47 a.m. No charges filed, no apology offered. He walked out in the same torn uniform he had been wearing when they put him on the ground 4 hours earlier. His chin was cut. His wrists carried deep red marks from the cuffs. His right shoulder was stiff where the joint had been wrenched during the takedown. A JAG officer, Major Constance Adler, was waiting in the parking lot. She drove him home without small talk. Drayton stared out the window with his hands resting on his knees, palms open, the way a man sits when he is holding something back. When the car turned onto his street, the scene had changed. Nadine was on the front lawn. Amara was beside her, eyes swollen. Colonel Hargrove stood near the driveway, Phone still in his hand, two Army CID agents in plain clothes had arrived 20 minutes earlier and were documenting everything. Scuff marks on the concrete, a bloodstain near the front tire track, a service cap still lying in the grass where it had rolled that morning. Neighbors had gathered along the sidewalk. Some had been there since the SUVs left. Drayton stepped out of the car and Nadine crossed the lawn to meet him. She didn't say anything. She just held him. Amara followed. Inside the house, military attorneys were already reviewing two phone recordings. Amara's footage from the upstairs window showed the full confrontation from above. Hargrove's video captured it from street level with clear audio. And a neighbor's Ring doorbell camera had recorded the entire arrest from a third angle, wide and unbroken, including the moment Pollard looked up and said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "I don't care if he's the president. He fits the description." Within 48 hours, 3 parallel investigations were open and moving fast. The DHS Office of Inspector General launched a formal inquiry into the conduct of the agents involved. Army CID opened its own case focused on the unlawful seizure of a flag officer and the treatment of his family. And the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division assigned a team to assess whether federal civil rights laws had been violated. Pollard and Fenton's personnel files were pulled the same day. What investigators found was not a surprise to anyone who had worked alongside Pollard, but it was damning on paper. 11 prior complaints of excessive force and racial targeting. Every single one internally reviewed. Every single one cleared. Body camera logs confirmed that neither agent had activated their cameras the morning of the arrest. Department policy required activation for all enforcement operations. A deeper audit revealed that Pollard's teams had failed to activate cameras on more than 40 prior operations. Nearly all of them took place in Black or Latino neighborhoods. No disciplinary action had ever been taken. Then, the emails surfaced. Internal communications between Pollard and his direct supervisor showed a pattern of awareness at the leadership level. In one message flagged by investigators, the supervisor acknowledged the volume of complaints against Pollard's unit and described him in writing as aggressive but effective. That phrase would appear in federal court filings within the month. It would be quoted in headlines within the week. And it would become the single most cited piece of evidence that the agency had known exactly who Victor Pollard was and had chosen to look the other way. 3 days after the arrest, the videos went public. Amara Drayton, with her parents' permission, posted her recording from the upstairs window to social media. The footage was shaky and raw. It showed her father standing alone in dress uniform on his own driveway, surrounded by agents in tactical gear. It showed the moment Pollard and Fenton drove him face first into the concrete. It showed the metals scraping the pavement. It showed her mother blocked on the front steps by men who wouldn't give their names. Hargrove's footage followed hours later, filmed from street level with steady hands and clear audio. His video captured Pollard's voice without distortion. Every order, every refusal to show a warrant, every word. Then the family's attorney released the Ring doorbell footage from the neighbor's camera across the street. The angle was wide and unbroken, capturing the full scene from the moment the SUVs arrived to the moment they pulled away with a general in the back seat. Combined, the 3 recordings left no room for ambiguity. A decorated black officer in full military dress thrown to the ground in his own driveway by federal agents who had no warrant bearing his name, while his wife was physically blocked and his teenage daughter watched from a window. The videos reached 10 million views in 3 days. National media picked it up within 24 hours. By the end of the week, every major outlet had run the story. The Pentagon issued a rare public statement confirming the incident and calling it an unacceptable violation of a service member's rights and dignity. Inside the ICE field office, phones stopped ringing with routine calls and started ringing with requests from congressional offices, inspector general liaisons, and defense attorneys preparing for what everyone now understood was coming. The fallout inside ICE was swift and systematic. Pollard and Fenton were placed on unpaid suspension within 72 hours of the arrest. Their firearms were confiscated, their credentials deactivated, their access to federal systems revoked. 6 additional agents who had been on the driveway that morning were reassigned to administrative duties pending internal review. Pollard's direct supervisor, the man who had written aggressive but effective in an email he never expected anyone outside the agency to read, was placed on administrative leave. The ICE director issued an internal memo to every field office in the country. The language was blunt. What occurred in Fayetteville represents an institutional failure at every level. It was a failure of leadership, a failure of oversight, and a failure to uphold the standards this agency is sworn to maintain. The DHS secretary went further. In a public statement carried by every major network, he confirmed that the arrest of Brigadier General Solomon Drayton was unlawful and that the department would cooperate fully with all ongoing investigations. Behind closed doors, the language was sharper. A senior DHS official told a room of agency attorneys that this was the worst single-incident civil rights exposure the department had faced in a decade. A federal grand jury was convened in the Eastern District of North Carolina. Prosecutors presented the video evidence, the personnel records, the complaint history, and the internal emails. They laid out a pattern that went beyond one morning on one driveway. Pollard's union representative attended the first day of proceedings and afterward called Pollard directly. His advice was short. Retain private counsel immediately. This is beyond what we can protect you from. Pollard hung up the phone, and for the first time since that Tuesday morning, the weight of what he had done began to settle. The grand jury returned indictments within 2 weeks. Victor Pollard was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, under 18 U.S.C. 242, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Craig Fenton was indicted as a co-conspirator for his direct role in the unlawful arrest and his years-long pattern of enabling Pollard's conduct without challenge. Their field supervisor was charged with failure to supervise and obstruction of justice for attempting to delay the release of internal complaint records in the days following the arrest. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. The jury watched all 3 videos in sequence. Amara's footage from the upstairs window, Hargrove's recording from the street, the Ring camera's wide, unbroken angle from across the driveway. They heard testimony from Drayton, who described the arrest with the same precision he brought to operational briefings. From Nadine, whose voice broke once when she described being told things would get worse for her husband if she didn't go inside. From Amara, who was asked what she saw from the window and answered, "I saw my father on the ground in his uniform, and I couldn't help him." From Colonel Hargrove, who told the court he had served in 3 wars and never seen an American service member treated that way on home soil. The jury reviewed the 11 prior complaints, the 40 operations without body cameras, the emails, the pattern. Deliberations lasted less than a day. Pollard was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Fenton was convicted and sentenced to 3 years. The supervisor received 18 months. All 3 were permanently barred from federal law enforcement. Their names were entered into the National Decertification Index. No federal agency would ever employ them again. The Drayton family filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against ICE, DHS, and the individual agents. The complaint cited unlawful detention, excessive force, racial profiling, Fourth Amendment violations, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The video evidence, the testimony, and the internal records made the case impossible to defend. The government settled before trial for $4.2 million, plus sweeping mandated reforms. Mandatory body camera activation with termination-level penalties for non-compliance. Independent civilian oversight of all warrant execution operations. A verification protocol requiring confirmed name match before any detention. And quarterly public reporting on use of force demographics broken down by race, location, and outcome. Drayton returned to duty within weeks. He never publicly discussed the settlement. He never appeared on television. He went back to work the same way he had walked out of his front door that morning. In uniform, on time, posture straight, voice steady. Months later, he was promoted to Major General. In his first address after the ceremony, standing before a room of officers and officials at Fort Liberty, he said one thing that made the room go still. "I have led soldiers into combat zones where the rules of engagement were clearer than what those agents followed in my own driveway." No one spoke for several seconds. Across DHS, a training bulletin was distributed to every field office in the country. It included a still frame from Amara Drayton's phone video. The image showed a man in full Army dress uniform lying face down on residential concrete, his medals flat against the pavement, his hands behind his back. The caption read, "This is what happens when bias replaces procedure." No names were printed. They didn't need to be. The careers were already gone. This case was disturbing.